Feedback and marking. So for schools in year one of the project, so it's a new choice for your school, we'd be looking again to use some of the key learning, research and reading from year one of the project. So we started this year by really having a good overview of feedback and marking. And we looked at the EEF's marking review, which is a marked improvement. So it was a review of written marking that came out in 2016. And we started the year by really looking at that with schools in detail, pulling out some of the highlights of that report and some of the recommendations. Some of those were quite enlightening for schools, some really interesting findings from teacher surveys and other research in there. We then had a look at the workload review, because in terms of feedback and marking, teachers and schools are very mindful of teachers' workload, so we had a look at what the workload review had to say in terms of feedback and marking. And Ofsted as well, we had a look at recommendations from Ofsted, what they do expect to see in terms of feedback and marking and what they don't. So that schools starting this project have got a really clear overview of what the research says, what I need to think about in terms of workload, and what Ofsted do and don't need to see. And that's given schools a real freedom to actually think, right, I can go ahead, I can make some changes, and I know what the research says, and I know what any other constraints are that I need to think about. We have then really started to have a look at some key reading. So The Power of Feedback 2007 by Hattie and Timperley is a key read for schools wanting to take this choice. Hattie is very key in terms of feedback and marking, and in that piece of reading he really goes into what feedback is, what do we really mean by feedback, and we explore that with schools. He also talks about the feedback loop and the importance of that feedback loop, and that if we're working with students and they're not actually responding to our feedback, they don't do anything with it, it's not actionable, then what we're giving isn't really feedback. So it's that whole loop, the system is incredibly important. Hattie also talks about 4 levels of feedback. So he talks about task level feedback, process level feedback, feedback to support children's self-regulation, and self-level feedback. And throughout the project over the year, we've explored all of those levels with schools. And in line with the research, what we found is that across the county, I think we've got 24 schools or so this year involved in feedback and marking. Lots of teachers are fantastic at task level feedback. We're very used to saying about one task, one specific piece of work, that's what you've done brilliantly, that's what you need to do to improve. But in line with the research, when we explored this with teachers sometimes, and TAs and children in their learning conversations, do struggle to move into process level feedback and feedback to support children's self-regulation. And the problem with only sticking with that task level feedback is that can be sometimes why children don't generalise their learning. And we hear, teachers saying, but I definitely taught them this, I definitely have taught capital letters and full stops, and they're still not doing them. But if we only ever mention that in relation to one piece of work, research suggests they relate that to that one piece of work, and they don't then use their strategies elsewhere. So process level feedback, talking about strategies and processes, and feedback to support self-regulation is really important. And throughout this year, we've explored with schools different ways to support teachers and TAs and children to have effective learning conversations, to give effective feedback, actually moving through those levels of feedback, not just remaining in task level feedback. Quite a difficult thing to do. Schools actually found it and teachers found it quite tricky to think about that. So we've come up with little rubrics and different resources throughout the year to really support schools to be able to focus on those different levels of feedback. And as Vanessa said from the toolkit, we know if we can give really effective feedback, then that can have an incredibly positive impact on pupil attainment and progress across our entire curriculum. So really important to get it right. And if we're going to remove some of our written marking, which is as Beth suggests that they have in their school, then we need to make sure that what we're replacing that with is very high quality and effective. We've also had a look at delayed versus instant feedback over the course of the year. We have had a look at peer feedback, and schools have made some interesting tweaks and changes to make that very effective, when potentially it hasn't been for schools in the past. And excitingly, we ran a feedback and marking trial across lots of schools in the county, and it was great because we had primary, secondary and special schools involved in our trial. And we examined over a short period of time the impact that written feedback, live feedback and whole class feedback had on pupil attainment and teacher workload. And we had some really interesting results from there, some really promising results. And again, in terms of our SEND pupils and pupil premium, what came out there really incredibly strong was that whole class feedback, where teachers are not writing in the children's books, but they're actually reading them all thoroughly, they're really thinking carefully about them, and they're adjusting their planning for the next day to really meet the needs of those children and address those learning gaps. So really, really interesting. For schools that are wanting to embed the learning from year one of the project, so they're going to do feedback and marking for the second year, we really want to embed and deepen some of that learning. There's so much that we could cover, so we've done quite a quick overview this year. For schools in the second year, we'll be looking to deepen that and embed that learning. We'd also be putting some new content in as well. So we've looked at peer assessment this year. In the second year, we'd be looking at self-assessment, and we'd also be looking at assessment and the effectiveness of the assessments that we give our children. There's research to suggest that sometimes when we set children little formative or summative assessments, that actually we're not testing what we think we're testing, in which case the feedback that we give is not going to have the most impact because there's potentially some flaws in our tests. We're also going to be looking at the validity of teacher judgments. Research suggests that if we gave, for example, all of you the same piece of work, you might all make quite different judgments about that piece of work. You might, based on your knowledge and experience of that particular area, or if you knew the child, you might all make quite different judgments about that piece of work. And that's important to consider when we're giving feedback because we want that consistency across our school. So we'd be looking next year at the importance of cooperative judgments in terms of marking feedback, moderation, and really thinking about how we might effectively do some of our marking feedback strategies a little bit differently and actually working together across the school or across the department. Potential for schools to have a go at their own feedback and marking trials. So we would be encouraging schools in the second year to be thinking about all of their learning from year one and thinking what they might really like to try in their own setting to make sure that the changes that they're making are the right ones for their pupils. Whether that be in an informal way or whether that be with some Mobilise support or support from the research school.